Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. He drank the cocktail she made. She kissed him goodnight, and within hours, he was dead. But it wasn't the alcohol, it was the dose. A dose 5 times the lethal amount. This wasn't an accident. This was murder, in a town that never expected it. March 4th, 2022. Camas, Utah. A quiet town tucked beneath the Wasatch Mountains, where crimes rarely rise above petty theft, and the biggest local scandal might be a zoning dispute. But that morning, around 3:22 a.m., a woman's calm voice reached the Summit County Dispatch. She said her husband wasn't breathing. No panic, no screams, just a statement, flat and clear. When first responders arrived, they found Eric Richens on the floor beside the bed in his own home, unconscious, cold to the touch, eyes partially open. It was clear to EMS almost immediately. He'd been dead for hours. Paramedics performed basic vitals, then stepped back. CPR wasn't just futile, it was medically irrelevant. Rigor had already set in. His wife, Corey Richens, stood nearby, 33 years old. No visible injuries, no signs of trauma. Her story was simple. They'd celebrated a real estate closing together that evening. She made him a cocktail, his favorite, a Moscow Mule, then went to sleep with one of their kids. When she came back hours later, she found him unresponsive. That's when she called 911. At first glance, the scene offered little to question. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. The home, recently renovated, was clean and still. But one detail stood out: the cocktail glass, resting untouched on the nightstand, with a small amount of liquid still inside. Not spilled, not moved. The responding deputy noted it specifically in his preliminary report. Everything looked orderly, too orderly. Eric was 39, a father of 3, owner of a successful construction company. He had no known health issues, no history of substance abuse. According to initial medical checks, there were no obvious indicators of stroke, cardiac event, or injury. Cause of death was unclear until the coroner's report landed 3 days later. The toxicology revealed a fatal amount of fentanyl in Eric's system. Not trace, not borderline. 5 times the lethal dose. It wasn't pharmaceutical-grade fentanyl used in hospitals. It was illicit, powdered, synthetic, and likely absorbed orally. The coroner's assessment was direct. This wasn't accidental exposure. The concentration was too high, the administration too clean. It was homicide by overdose. Eric had no fentanyl prescription. He hadn't been under pain management. His blood work was otherwise clean. The source had to be introduced from the outside, and based on the location of residue on the glass, the only plausible vector was the cocktail, the same drink his wife had admitted preparing, the same glass she left behind. Standard procedure followed. Investigators secured both Eric's and Corey's phones, as well as electronic devices from the home. They began running the digital timeline against Corey's statement. According to her, she'd gone to bed around 9:30 p.m. after celebrating with her husband. But data pulled from her phone showed usage past midnight, visiting shopping sites, reading real estate blogs, and, more significantly, making a series of Venmo payments to a user labeled CL. Each payment was under $900, sent in succession within a 15-minute window. The notes were blank. The total, just under $2,700, bypassed standard financial alert thresholds. Financial evasion? Possibly. Routine? Not likely. The police flagged the payments for follow-up. Simultaneously, the investigative team conducted interviews with friends and family. That's when the next critical detail surfaced. 2 weeks prior, on Valentine's Day, Eric had experienced a severe allergic reaction after eating a sandwich Corey had made for lunch. He used his EpiPen and stabilized, never going to the hospital. But he did make one significant remark to his sister. "I think she tried to poison me." At the time, the comment had been taken as a frustrated exaggeration. Eric didn't press charges. He didn't report it. But now, with the autopsy in hand, that comment held weight. It would become a cornerstone in the timeline prosecutors would later use to establish premeditation. The marriage from the outside had appeared stable. Their social media pages were filled with family pictures, matching outfits, and motivational captions. Eric's business was profitable, and Curry had started publishing children's books. But behind that polished exterior, something else was unraveling. Investigators found multiple life insurance policies taken out on Eric in the past 5 years, two of them applied for by Curry herself. The total potential payout exceeded $2 million. One policy, filed just months before Eric's death, had a forged signature. Eric had not authorized it. Digging deeper into financial records revealed a pattern of growing debt under Curry's name: failed home flips, maxed out business loans, and back taxes. Several payments were past due. Her business was under pressure, the kind of pressure that motivates drastic solutions. With cause of death confirmed and motive beginning to emerge, attention returned to the physical crime scene. A second sweep was conducted, this time with forensic teams focusing on chemical residue. Swabs taken from the cocktail glass confirmed fentanyl presence. Trace particles were also found inside the kitchen sink's disposal system. Residue had bonded to the interior of the drain. It wasn't detectable to the eye, but it was there. No gloves, no handling equipment. Whoever administered the drug did it unprotected, either unaware or unconcerned with the risks. The technical evidence began to form a sequence: opportunity, access, motive, and now delivery. But as any seasoned investigator knows, evidence doesn't mean guilt. Yet. So far, Curry Richens had not been charged with any crime. She maintained her innocence and continued living in the family home with their 3 sons. She posted online about grief. She dedicated her children's book to Eric's memory. She told friends she wanted to help kids learn to cope with loss. But investigators were not focused on coping. They were focused on reconstruction. The next steps would involve tracing the source of the fentanyl, following the digital trail, and dissecting every inconsistency in the timeline. Because clean scenes don't guarantee clean hands, and a cocktail left standing may speak louder than any scream. From the outside, it looked like a clean American success story. Young couple, 3 children, a growing business. A new house in the hills of Kamas, Utah. Neighbors said the Richens family kept to themselves, but seemed close. Social media painted a curated portrait, matching Christmas pajamas, birthday cakes, date nights. But behind closed doors, the records told a different version. One that investigators would soon uncover line by line. Bank statements, insurance policies, title deeds, loan defaults. The real marriage had pressure points, and they weren't new. 3 weeks after Eric Richens' death, the forensic accounting team from Summit County began the asset and liability breakdown. The first red flag came from life insurance. Eric had 3 policies. One was a standard employer policy through his construction company. The second, valued at $500,000, had been active for 4 years. The third, filed in early 2022, was for $2 million. That last one stood out. It was submitted using an electronic signature, but Eric's legal counsel confirmed he had never authorized it. That meant someone else had, and the application listed the sole beneficiary as his spouse, Curry Richens. The agent attached to the $2 million policy confirmed via deposition that Curry had been persistent about moving it forward. She emailed twice about speeding up underwriting. She also asked on record if payouts were affected by overdose deaths. That specific question was time-stamped, February 14, 2022. The same day Eric reportedly suffered a sudden allergic reaction after eating a sandwich at home. That event, which had gone undocumented until now, was reevaluated in the context of the policy timeline. Investigators requested his pharmacy records. Eric had an active prescription for an EpiPen, issued the following day. Prior to that, no allergy history. When detectives reviewed the couple's recent financial history, the motive for risk became more visible. Curry Richens had borrowed against 2 properties under her business license, Richens Realty Group LLC. One flip project in Heber was halted due to lack of funding. The other had been sitting unsold for 5 months. Combined, the losses exceeded $360,000. Records from Utah Department of Commerce revealed that Curry had defaulted on a line of credit with a local lender who had issued a final notice in mid-February. Emails between her and the lender included phrases like, "We are restructuring to cover liquidity gaps," and "My husband is working on accessing other funds." He wasn't. Eric's personal finances were clean. He carried no significant personal debt, maintained multiple business accounts, and paid taxes quarterly. His books were up to date. What investigators found instead was that Corey had been attempting to move funds between his accounts and her failing business under the justification of temporary liquidity pooling. She wasn't listed as an authorized user on 2 of the 3 business checking accounts. She had tried to change that in January. Her request was denied. Digital forensics turned to email metadata. One draft found in Curry's Gmail, dated February 21st, was an unfinished letter of inquiry to a financial advisor, asking about estate liquidation procedures in the event of sudden spousal death. The draft had not been sent, but the timestamp and language were preserved. The question facing investigators was no longer why Eric had died. It was when the plan had begun, and the records were narrowing it down to within a 45-day window. A deeper dive into domestic activity painted a starker picture. In late January, Eric had reached out to a divorce attorney in Salt Lake City. He had not filed yet, but the intake interview noted that Eric had concerns over trust, financial deception, and emotional manipulation. The attorney noted he was cautious, but emotionally ready. That file, once sealed, was now accessible under homicide investigation parameters. The next forensic development came from location data. Using cell phone tower triangulation and Wi-Fi pings, Eric's phone had remained in the house the entire night of March 3rd. Corey's device, however, showed brief movement between 12:47 and 1:11 a.m., exiting Wi-Fi range, reconnecting on return. When asked, she stated she had been up checking on one of the children. That explanation was noted, but not consistent with the signal behavior. A second warrant was issued for Ring camera data from a neighbor's property. Footage revealed that the exterior house lights at the Rickens home had been switched on manually around 12:53 a.m., remained on for 6 minutes, and then turned off. No visual of a person, but the timestamp aligned exactly with the device movement. Forensic analysts noted, sequence is suggestive of external movement, possibly discarding or retrieving item outside primary residence. No garbage bin scheduled, no visitor logs, no delivery. The theory wasn't finalized, but it was forming. Sometimes investigators say the quietest homes hold the loudest contradictions. The same family that published cheerful photos weeks before had conversations about divorce, hidden loans, and unsigned insurance. The veneer was clean. The structure was not. By April 2022, the composite timeline looked like this. February 14th, Eric suffers suspected allergic reaction. February 21st, insurance question email draft created. March 1st, final Venmo transfers sent to known fentanyl source. March 3rd, 9:41 p.m. Eric's last known communication. March 4th, 3:22 a.m. Curry calls 911. Each timestamp carried weight. None of them were accidental. The public, by then, was starting to take notice. Local headlines shifted from obituary to inquiry. The case wasn't officially labeled a homicide yet, but law enforcement had already marked the death as suspicious with unresolved toxicological factors. Internal memos used sharper language. Meanwhile, the children were moved to the care of extended family under protective order. What remains of a perfect life when you remove the filters? According to one officer on the case, it wasn't about love, it was about leverage. And sometimes you don't realize you're part of the equation until the math stops adding up. This chapter marked the beginning of that subtraction. By late April 2022, the toxicology report had confirmed fentanyl as the cause of Eric Richens' death. The digital trail had exposed a series of questionable financial transactions. But what investigators uncovered next was arguably more critical than any lab result. A timeline that didn't begin on the night of March 3rd. It began 2 weeks earlier, with a sandwich. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Eric Richens suffered a sudden medical emergency while at home. According to statements later given by his sister and a longtime family friend, Eric had come into work that morning visibly shaken. He told one colleague he had nearly passed out after lunch. His voice was hoarse. He was disoriented. He had used his EpiPen for the first time in his life. There was no confirmed allergy on his medical record, no prior prescriptions for antihistamines or epinephrine. The family had no history of food allergies. But that day, Eric believed something in the sandwich his wife prepared had caused the reaction. He didn't go to the emergency room. He didn't file a police report. But he did tell his sister later that evening, something felt wrong. It didn't taste right. Forensic relevance emerged when detectives cross-referenced this date, February 14th, with previously subpoenaed phone data. That same day, Curry's browser history showed a visit to a website discussing ways to induce allergic reactions. Investigators flagged the entry, and cyber analysts later extracted a cached session containing queries about EpiPen timing, non-lethal reactions, and food masking agents. It wasn't conclusive, but it was indicative of forethought. More compelling was what came next. Venmo records, which had been partially reviewed in Chapter 2, revealed a critical set of transactions on February 11th, 3 days prior to the Valentine's incident. Curry had sent two payments, each under $900 to a contact known only as CL. The transaction labels were left blank, but when investigators obtained a secondary search warrant for her messages, they found text conversations with a person using the initials CL, a known individual in Summit County with a criminal history of controlled substance possession. The texts, later introduced into the official case file, included a message sent on February 10th. Can you get something for pain, but strong, like not from a pharmacy? The reply, you want perks or more hardcore? Her response, Fent, but the kind that works, not baby dose. That exchange changed the course of the investigation. What had initially seemed like a suspicious overdose was now being retroactively classified as a possible second attempt. The first attempt? A failed poisoning masked as an allergic reaction. Detectives re-interviewed the friend who'd witnessed Eric that day. He recalled Eric telling him that he felt drugged and was planning to take a few days off work. He never made that official. He returned the next day and said he was over it. But behind the scenes, something had shifted. Phone records showed that in the days following February 14th, Eric reached out to a financial advisor he'd worked with years prior. According to internal logs, he requested a quote to revise his will. He also inquired about securing a private living trust separate from joint assets. None of these documents were finalized, but the steps had begun. A digital footprint alone doesn't always reflect motive. But when coupled with financial duress, personal instability, and direct evidence of sourcing lethal drugs, it paints a specific picture, a picture of preparation. Law enforcement traced the Venmo recipient, CL, to a man in his mid-30s who had previous drug charges dropped under a plea deal in 2019. He was now cooperating as a confidential informant. Under controlled interview, he admitted to supplying around 5 pills of fentanyl-laced substances to Corey Richens in early February. He claimed she said it was for a friend who had back problems but couldn't get a script. He sold the pills, received payment through split transactions, and didn't ask further questions. However, he also admitted that after Eric Richens' death made the news, Corey messaged him again, this time more aggressively. She asked for stronger stuff and told him to delete everything. That message had already been deleted on her end. It was recovered from his device. Investigators now believe that the Valentine's incident was not coincidental. It was not a misstep. It was a preliminary attempt, testing potency, reaction, or possibly gauging timing. The sandwich may not have contained enough. The second dose did. Curry's defense team later argued that the messages were taken out of context, that she was trying to help a friend. But that friend has never been identified. No one else ever came forward as the intended recipient. And as detectives would later point out, Eric was the only person who experienced physical symptoms. With this new information, prosecutors began structuring the narrative toward premeditation. They now had 3 key dates with drug sourcing activity, February 11th, March 1st, and March 3rd. Each transaction was tied to the same contact. Each was followed by either a medical event or a fatality. The pattern had form, and form meant admissibility. One element that stood out to investigators during the February incident was the lack of any medical escalation. No ER visit, no toxicology screen. Nothing that would alert external authorities. That, they noted, may have been intentional. The initial dose was low, enough to cause discomfort, but not enough to risk a reportable emergency. It slipped under the radar. But it left a record behind, and that record would soon support one of the most chilling allegations in Utah homicide court history. In small towns like Camas, crime is expected to look a certain way: sudden, violent, obvious. But increasingly, law enforcement sees something else: deliberate, calculated harm delivered in doses, over days, behind curtains. Quiet crime. And sometimes the scariest crimes are the ones that don't look like crimes at all. In homicide investigations, the absence of a confession rarely halts momentum. The absence of fingerprints doesn't end inquiry. What matters increasingly is metadata, silent records left behind by devices most people never think to erase. And in the case of Eric Richens, it was digital residue, not blood, not a weapon, that began to form the backbone of a prosecution. By mid-May 2022, forensic analysts from the Utah State Crime Lab had retrieved 2 iPhones, a MacBook, and a secondary iPad from the Richens residence. Each belonged to a member of the household, but only one, the iPhone registered to Corey Richens, contained a deleted browser history in the critical 48-hour window surrounding March 3rd. Deleted files aren't gone. They are only unindexed. Using Celebrite extraction software, digital investigators recovered fragments of search terms, cached autofill fields, and time-stamped login credentials. In the early hours of March the 2nd, Corey's device accessed a series of queries on fentanyl shelf life, delayed release formulations, and how long opioids remain detectable in postmortem analysis. The queries weren't random. They were sequential. Investigators noted that the searches had been manually deleted after 10:11 p.m. on March 3rd, within hours of Eric's final text message and just before the suspected time of poisoning. The device had then remained idle until 12:47 a.m., when it connected to a different Wi-Fi node on the property, likely outside the home. The movement aligned with a previously identified window where Corey's phone exited and re-entered the home network range. The significance of that gap, 34 minutes, would become more relevant with each recovered data point. Simultaneously, email forensics identified a previously unsent message saved in Corey's Gmail drafts folder. Dated February 21st, the message was addressed to a contact listed only by initials. It included the phrase, "I need it clean, no taste, fast." The context wasn't clear at first, but the timing, following the failed Valentine's incident, made it worth preserving. That draft wasn't the only anomaly. Investigators also located a series of encrypted messages in the iMessage logs of the iPad, which had been synced with Corey's Apple ID. Though the messages themselves had been wiped, Apple's log metadata preserved timestamps and contact patterns. Over the span of 2 weeks, beginning February 24th, one particular contact appeared at irregular intervals: 3:02 a.m., 12:19 a.m., 2:47 a.m., all outside normal hours. The device data was legally admissible due to search warrants already granted based on earlier evidence. From that point, police began cross-referencing location data with message logs, looking not for content, but for behavior. Patterns, after all, are the new witness testimony. The culmination of this digital review led to the recovery of one partial audio file, a voice memo recorded, seemingly by accident, on March the 2nd. The file, just under 9 seconds long, contained what analysts described as a drawer opening and a whispered voice saying, "Do it right this time." The voice was never definitively attributed, but forensic enhancement confirmed it was recorded on the same device found on Corey's side of the bed. Though circumstantial in nature, the audio file was deemed contextually significant by the district attorney's office. At the same time, Eric's own digital footprint continued to support the growing theory of premeditation. His phone logs showed no indication of illness, drug use, or contact with any individual involved in narcotics. His final web searches conducted earlier that day were routine: weather, lumber pricing, and a brief email exchange with his project foreman. The contrast between his stable digital presence and the high-risk behavior occurring in proximity was hard to ignore. Notably, Eric's work email inbox contained a saved message dated January 28th. Subject line, "Contingency documents." In it, a financial advisor outlined steps to separate joint holdings. The email was marked unread, but had been opened on February 16th, just 2 days after his allergic reaction. Taken together, the digital material wasn't speculation. It was sequencing. It revealed intent not in a single act, but in a sustained pattern of preparation, research, contact, deletion, adjustment. Every step had been made in private. Every move was masked behind routine behavior, but the forensic record had held. One analyst involved in the extraction summarized it best. People talk about digital footprints, but that's not accurate. It's more like a fingerprint. Everyone's is unique. Everyone's shows pressure when you look close enough. For prosecutors, the digital evidence would be introduced not to replace motive or toxicology, but to align with it. Because in this case, the computer knew what the body couldn't say. And sometimes the silence left behind by a victim is filled by the devices they never touched. 2 months after Eric Richens was found dead in his bedroom, a children's book quietly appeared online. Its title was Are You With Me? The author, Corey Richens. On the cover, a young boy looked toward the sky, a shadowy father figure above him, translucent and smiling. The timing wasn't lost on anyone close to the case. Investigators were still building out digital forensic sequencing. The cause of death had been formally certified. The toxicology reports had already confirmed lethal fentanyl. But Corey was not under arrest, not yet. Instead, she was publicly reframing herself, not as a suspect, but as a grieving widow. And the book was her tool. Within days of its release, Are You With Me? Gained local media attention. Articles framed it as a heartfelt story to help children process grief. Corey granted interviews. She described the writing process as healing. She said her children were her reason for going on. What the interviews didn't mention were the subpoenas already issued on her financial accounts, or the search warrants for her devices. The public face was one thing. The case file was something else entirely. From an investigative standpoint, the book raised new concerns, not because of its content, but because of its calculated use. Eric's family had not been notified in advance. His image, implied through illustrations and text, was featured prominently. The dedication page referred to him as the best father, taken too soon. It was signed simply, K. One of Eric's sisters later told prosecutors, "We were still trying to bury our brother. She was selling paperbacks." That statement triggered a procedural review. The Summit County Attorney's Office began examining the possibility of asset freezing. Corey had self-published the book through Amazon's KDP platform. The revenue was modest, but under Utah law, income derived from an act potentially connected to a criminal event may be subject to seizure under the Son of Sam statute. Parallel to the legal review, a deeper dive into behavioral forensics began. Investigators contacted the illustrator and editor involved in the project. Both provided invoices, emails, and time logs. The contract had been initiated in late March 2022, within weeks of Eric's death. The manuscript was finalized in early April. This meant the book had been in production while the autopsy was still pending. From a cold case analysis lens, it introduced a new layer, psychological posture. Not only had Corey not distanced herself from the narrative, she had attempted to own it, not with silence, but with storytelling. Inside the investigative team, that decision was viewed not as grief but as control. At the same time, more forensic information was returned from the lab. The remnants from the cocktail glass, tested down to trace particles, matched the same batch of fentanyl later tied to the Venmo-linked source. That connection, technical and confirmable, gave prosecutors something they hadn't had before: direct physical correlation between a purchase, a substance, and a death. Still, the arrest hadn't happened. Instead, the next step was coordination. In May 2023, internal memos from the district attorney's office began outlining trial strategy. The book itself wouldn't be introduced as evidence of guilt, but it would be used to establish timeline behavior. How quickly the author transitioned from death to monetization, how her narrative diverged from known facts, and how it omitted context that would later become central to the case. One question surfaced again and again: how do you tell a story to children about grief when you may have caused it? By late spring, the book had sold fewer than 200 copies, but the damage wasn't about royalties, it was about perception. To the public, she had become a tragic figure. To law enforcement, she had become a case study in diversion. In cases like this, the hardest part isn't always proving what happened. Sometimes it's cutting through what people want to believe. about family, about marriage, about who's capable of harm and who isn't. Eric Richins was not a public figure. He didn't publish books or seek media attention, but his image had been repurposed, rebranded, and distributed before the final toxicology report was even processed. That fact mattered, not as motive, but as method. And in that method, prosecutors saw intent. By late May 2023, the investigation into Eric Richins' death had moved beyond quiet suspicion. Prosecutors were no longer building a theory, they were cross-referencing it. The digital footprint was established. The financial motive was documented. The toxicology findings were irrefutable. What they needed now was forensic confirmation that the poison wasn't just present, but placed, and that it had come from one direction. Crime scene technicians were redeployed to the Richins residence for a targeted evidence recovery operation. The first search, conducted days after the death, had prioritized securing the scene, photographing, and collecting standard surface samples. Now, with new warrants in hand and a clearer working theory, the second search focused on trace-level residue and structural material. They began with the kitchen. Swabs from the interior drain pipe of the kitchen sink tested positive for fentanyl. Not trace amounts carried by accident, but a concentration consistent with partial rinsing. The cocktail glass, already cataloged in evidence, had previously tested positive along the rim. Now the inside of the sink and the metal of the disposal unit confirmed that remnants had been washed directly into the drain. Investigators documented this chain with time-stamped photography and chemical mapping. The implication, whoever had prepared the fentanyl-laced drink had cleaned the container, partially, but hadn't accounted for residual deposits that would bond to the steel components beneath. In addition to the sink, a garbage can liner from the night of March 3rd had been preserved during the original collection. At the time, it had shown no visible blood or biological material and was therefore not tested. On review, crime lab analysts re-examined the liner using mass spectrometry and detected fentanyl on one section, alongside orange residue matching the type of powdered drink flavoring found in the cocktail mix. It wasn't visual, it wasn't obvious, but under forensic light, the details lined up. Parallel to the lab work, investigators conducted follow-up interviews with close family members, primarily focusing on the 48 hours before and after Eric's death. One friend recalled that Corey appeared unusually upbeat at Eric's celebration dinner. Another family member stated she laughed a lot during the small gathering. These observations weren't offered as evidence of guilt, but as contrast. Grief behaves differently for everyone. Law enforcement didn't base anything on demeanor alone. But when juxtaposed with the mounting physical evidence, the cracks in the facade became harder to ignore. Financial analysts within the task force compiled a final timeline of transactions. On March 1st, 2 days before Eric died, Corey sent another payment to the same Venmo contact, this time for $900. The payment had no note. It was split into two parts. The justification for that structure, according to digital forensics, matched an earlier behavior pattern: staggered payments to avoid transaction flags. The district attorney's office now had cause of death confirmed by fentanyl toxicity, financial transactions linking Corey to a fentanyl source, timeline consistency between purchases and physiological outcomes, physical residue found in the sink, disposal unit, and trash lining, contradictions in Corey's narrative and demeanor before and after death. They also had the children. Though not direct witnesses, the three Richins boys had been home the night their father died. They had been put to bed. None had entered the master bedroom, but investigators secured interviews with child psychologists present to observe Corey's interactions in the weeks that followed. One analyst noted her behavior as performance-driven, especially in public forums. This wasn't the basis for indictment, but it did reinforce what prosecutors were starting to believe. The grief narrative was strategic. The final piece came with the fingerprint report. Though no fingerprints had been found on the inside of the cocktail glass, partial prints were recovered on the bottle of flavored mix used to prepare the drink. One matched Corey. No other prints were viable. Given that Eric had not prepared his own drink and that the flavor packet had been opened within the last 48 hours, prosecutors filed the chain of evidence under control and opportunity. Taken individually, none of these discoveries would have secured a conviction, but together they formed what prosecutors call a convergence zone. Multiple data points, each consistent with guilt, and none credibly explained away. By June 2023, the charging decision was finalized. Eric Ricken's death was no longer categorized as unexplained. It was classified as first-degree aggravated homicide. The suspect was his wife. Behind the smiling author photos, behind the interviews and the dedications, there was now a full evidentiary record. The face the public had seen, the grief-stricken widow reading to children in a library, was about to be reintroduced to a jury as the central figure in a fatal deception. In communities like Summit County, these kinds of cases are rare, not because the people are different, but because the masks usually hold. When they slip, it's not always loud. Sometimes it's a mistake in a payment, a trace on a sink, a shift in tone, one crack at a time. The official charge was filed on May 8, 2023. It read, murder, first-degree aggravated homicide. The name listed as defendant, Corey Richens. By the time the paperwork reached the court clerk's desk, a tactical team was already en route to her home in Camas. At approximately 5:37 a.m., Corey Richens was taken into custody without incident. She was located in the living room, dressed in workout clothes, seated at a kitchen table, reviewing printed drafts of her second children's book. The arresting officers executed a warrant signed hours earlier by a judge who had reviewed a 172-page case file, which now included lab results, financial documentation, digital forensics, and witness statements. She didn't ask why she was being arrested. She already knew. Once in custody, she was booked at the Summit County Jail. No bond was granted. The charge sheet included additional counts: possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, attempted murder relating to the February incident, and multiple counts of fraudulent insurance documentation. The case had shifted. What began as an unexplained death was now a formal criminal prosecution. The Utah Attorney General's office assigned 2 senior prosecutors with prior experience in complex financial motive homicides. The defense retained a private legal team with backgrounds in white-collar litigation and media-sensitive cases. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for August 2023. In preparation for the hearing, the prosecution filed a motion to consolidate all charges, murder, fraud, and drug-related offenses, into a single case. Their argument: each action was part of an ongoing course of conduct, unified by a single objective: financial gain through the planned death of a spouse. The defense objected. They claimed character assassination. They argued that emotional speculation was being substituted for evidence. But the evidence already established in prior chapters of the investigation wasn't speculative. It was procedural. At the preliminary hearing, the state presented a narrowed but focused narrative. They began with the medical examiner's conclusion: death by acute fentanyl toxicity. Then they introduced financial records showing repeated attempts by Corey to alter life insurance policies in her favor, without Eric's knowledge or consent. The digital forensic expert from the Utah State Crime Lab testified next. He explained how deleted search histories were recovered, how timestamps aligned with Venmo transactions, and how the drug residue matched materials from the kitchen and garbage disposal. Then came the evidence that hadn't been made public: a recorded jailhouse phone call. 2 days after her arrest, Corey had placed a call to a friend. The call was monitored as standard protocol. During that conversation, she referred to the ongoing investigation as a misunderstanding that would be cleaned up once she could talk to the boys. She also made a comment about erasing the old stuff. Investigators later clarified that the old stuff likely referred to prior text messages and drafts that had already been recovered. The prosecution offered that as proof of continuing consciousness of guilt. After 5 days of testimony, the judge ruled that probable cause existed on all counts. Corey would stand trial. The date was set for April 28, 2025, almost exactly 3 years after Eric's death. The public reaction was swift. Local news networks broadcast the footage of her in shackles. Commentators questioned how someone who authored a book on grief could be the cause of it. National outlets picked up the case as it moved toward trial. The story had already spread, but now it was formalized under the full weight of criminal law. Within the legal documents, one thing was clear: the prosecution did not rely on a single dramatic piece of evidence. No confession, no video, no eyewitness. Instead, they built a foundation from measurable facts: chemical residue, payment patterns, file recovery, and behavioral inconsistencies. Brick by brick, they constructed a structure that prosecutors believed the defense could not shake. At the center of that structure stood a question not about motive or method, but about timing. How soon after planning had Corey acted? How calculated was each step? And perhaps more haunting, what would have happened if the first attempt had succeeded? In homicide cases driven by financial desperation, patterns tend to escalate. Victims become data points. Evidence becomes routine. But investigators in this case were deliberate in showing the human side of the loss. Eric Richins was not a theory. He was a father, a business owner, and someone who, just weeks before his death, had told his sister he was afraid. And fear, when documented early, becomes powerful context later. As the court entered the pretrial phase, every piece of evidence, every keystroke, every transaction, every residue sample would be reviewed again under stricter rules of admissibility. But the charge was in place. The system had moved from suspicion to indictment. The mask so carefully constructed in public had fractured, and by now the cracks were visible to everyone. As spring turned into summer in 2023, Summit County prosecutors moved forward with formal charges. Corey Richins was indicted for the murder of her husband, Eric Richins, and for multiple counts of possessing and distributing a controlled substance, specifically fentanyl. The physical and digital evidence was overwhelming. But in the world of criminal trials, truth still had to compete with theatrics. The autopsy had already established that Eric died from a lethal dose of illicit fentanyl, 5 times the amount typically fatal. The pill residue found in his system did not match any prescription he was ever issued. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of suicide, and no medical justification for fentanyl use. The timeline of ingestion matched closely with the drink Corey had prepared for him on the night he died. Investigators presented clear proof that Corey had made repeated contact with a known drug dealer in the months leading up to Eric's death. The dealer later testified, under immunity, that Corey had requested some of the Michael Jackson stuff, a street name referencing powerful opioids, on more than one occasion. She asked for it in pills that would dissolve fast and wouldn't be easy to trace. Text messages recovered from her phone painted an even darker picture. While Corey presented herself publicly as a grieving widow, behind the scenes she was sending cheerful updates to the dealer, requesting more doses, and thanking them for the special order. These weren't the texts of someone experimenting out of curiosity. They were deliberate. They showed planning, intent. On the financial side, prosecutors outlined motive. Eric had discovered before his death that Corey had opened secret life insurance policies on him, totaling nearly $2 million. He had also removed her from his will and appointed his sister as the trustee for his estate. Evidence revealed Eric was planning to consult divorce attorneys and change the beneficiary of his other assets. These changes, made just weeks before his death, suggested he had become suspicious and was taking steps to protect himself. And then there was the book. Corey Richins had written and published a children's book about grief called Are You With Me? Allegedly to help her sons cope with losing their father. She went on television promoting the book as a healing tool for other families. But in the courtroom, it became a damning exhibit. The prosecution argued that the book wasn't about healing at all. It was about image control. Corey needed to appear like a loving widow, not a suspect. And a published book gave her an alibi in plain sight. She cared. She was grieving. She was moving forward. But beneath the surface, the financial records didn't lie. Corey had been moving money rapidly, paying off personal debts, covering failing business expenses, and attempting to claim on Eric's life insurance policy just days after his funeral. When denied, she filed appeals and contacted multiple insurance agents trying to unlock access. These were not the actions of a woman in mourning. They were acts of desperation cloaked in performance. The defense tried to cast doubt on the timeline, suggesting someone else could have laced the drink or that Eric had a hidden drug problem. But medical records, toxicology reports, and the absence of fentanyl in the home prior to Corey's purchases dismantled the argument. No witnesses could place Eric using illicit drugs, and his toxicology history was clean before this incident. The defense also attempted to challenge the credibility of the dealer's testimony, But even without the dealer's words, the phone logs, cash transfers, and location pings placed Curry in contact with the source on multiple occasions, before and after her husband's death. During the trial, jurors were shown Eric's final messages. Hours before his death, he had texted a family friend, saying he no longer trusted Corey and that he believed she might be trying to harm him. "If anything happens to me, look at her," he wrote. That message was not ignored. In May 2025, after weeks of arguments and over 70 pieces of evidence admitted into the record, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of aggravated murder, guilty of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. Corey Richens, once hailed in interviews as a devoted mother and community figure, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was quiet. No outbursts, no vindication, just silence. Eric's family declined public interviews, but one of his sisters issued a written statement. He trusted the wrong person. He tried to protect his children, and in the end, he saved them from a future built on lies. As the judge concluded sentencing, he made a final note. This case is not only about loss, it's about the exploitation of loss, for gain, for money, and for attention. That is what makes this crime uniquely cruel. Corey was led from the courtroom in cuffs. For the community, for the viewers, and for anyone watching, the warning remains. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't arrive with a mask or a weapon. Sometimes it comes with a smile and a cocktail. A tragedy like this is a reminder to recognize red flags, not just in strangers, but in those closest to us. In the end, stories like this remind me why we must stay vigilant, not just about the people around us, but about the silence between the words, the motives behind the kindness. If sharing this case helps even one person pause and ask the hard questions, then it matters. We owe it to those we've lost to learn from their stories, not just mourn them. What do you think about this case? Have you ever seen red flags others ignored? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if this video made you stop and think, let me know where you're watching from. If it didn't resonate with you, tell me why. Let's talk. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next case that might just open your eyes to something real.